Good morning and welcome to Made by Me with Grey Roots. I'm Laura and I'm the programs coordinator here at Grey Roots Museum and Archives, and I'm so glad that you can join us today. Today we are going to talk a bit about quilts and then make a felt quilt. So when we're thinking about this activity, we were wanting to do something a little bit of a step down from what our Wednesday activity is, which is going to be the pinwheel quilt or bag, just a piece of art. And so to do something a little more hands-on and really like textile or tactile, we created this felt quilt. So we're going to talk a little bit about quilts and then the craft, but first we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So remember, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box and keep your camera and microphone muted. If you're watching the recording of this, please don't hesitate to give us an email and ask any questions that you may have. So, I brought in one of my favorite quilts from growing up. So it was gifted to me from my grandma, and it's a little rough around the edges, but this quilt is made with a technique that's called applique. So there's the actual quilt, which is a series of squares and then rectangles, and even like littler squares, and then an applique of the butterfly is stitched on, and then there's a little bit of extra embroidery stitching as well. So that's going to be something that's important when we talk about our felt quilt when we are designing it. So before we get to the actual activity, we have another visit to make into our collections department with our summer staff, Jacob. He has an exciting quilt from our collection to share with us today.
Hello, my name is Jacob Freilich, a summer student at Grey Roots Museum and Archives, and this is our collections room. Today, I will be talking about this quilt, one of the artifacts in our collection. This quilt was made sometime between 1875 and 1881, which is around 139 to 145 years ago. The quilt's top was made by Isabel Wilson of Sullivan Township, Grey County, while the bottom of the quilt was added on later by someone unknown. This quilt was last owned by Isabel Wilson's daughter, Olive M. Wilson, before it entered the museum's collection. The quilt itself is made up of around 2,500 hexagonal patches and lacks a clearly defined pattern. This style makes it a type of quilt known as a mosaic quilt. Mosaic quilts such as this one were inspired by tile mosaic artwork, with the designs and shape of their patches being reminiscent of the tiles used in such artwork. While many mosaic quilts also emulate the types of landscapes and imagery seen in much tile mosaic artwork, that is not true for all cases, as can clearly be seen with this quilt. The backside of the quilt, which was added on later, is made up of blue and white flannelette and is designed with crisscrossing lines, reindeer, and flowers. As the quilt top was initially made on its own, it may have been made to use up scrap fabric with the hexagonal patches, rather than just throwing that fabric out. I find this quilt quite interesting due to the potential reasoning behind its creation and why it may not have been initially finished, as well as its unique design. That's all I have to say for today, and I hope you enjoyed.
And what a beautiful quilt in our collection. And that actually ties in really well to what I'm going to talk about before we get into the craft. So I will include this in the email with the recording. So I made some printable pattern blocks that you can just print on some cardstock, but then also some tanagram printables that you could color or print out. And same thing with there will be a black and white printable, and then there's also one that will already be colored. So it's up to you. But I found it was really great to play around with the pattern blocks and the tanagrams, just to play with, well, what do I want my quilt to look like? So in your quilt, your kit supplies, there will be a couple of larger pieces of felt, and then there's a lot of the littler pieces. And this is actually one of the best ones to look at. So looking at this, you can kind of see it's not so square-like. So with that one, I might set it aside for one of the ones I cut, or I'll just make it more square when I need it. So yeah, some of the pieces are a little less square, more rectangle, but using scissors you can create whatever shapes you need. Because that's one of the important things is when we look at any quilts, if you have any quilts in your house or if your family has any quilts, you can ask to have a look at them because they're going to be made out of different shapes. So they're not all just squares. There could be triangles, and like I showed before, there was the butterfly applique. But you can kind of play with it. So with this one, I had a 6-sided shape, some squares, some rhombuses, some triangles, and then I cut two of these. So for my bigger shapes, I just had 2 pieces of yellow, so I'm gonna start with that. So it's kind of like this, and then I was gonna play off of this kind of idea and kind of just make a really intricate like pattern, like that's like a flower, or just something that's really gonna be eye-catching because the colors that we chose for the felt are very bright. So when you get started, you can cut your larger pieces into whatever shape is important. So that's why if you can print off the pattern block shapes or the tanagrams, I can't talk today, then you can play with what you want your plan to be, because when you cut your felt, that's going to be the final cut kind of thing. So I'm going to put this kind of in the center, and then I'm not going to touch my glue yet. I'm just going to play with the different shapes and the colors that I have, because I like bright colors, and sometimes I like symmetry, but I might mix it up a bit depending. So you can just kind of play with the different pieces of felt, and you don't even have to at the end glue them down. You can always just take a nice picture of them to remember what you created and just keep working on it, because it's really nice. This felt's very nice to feel, nice to touch. And one of the interesting things too is that you can layer it. So if you remember my butterfly quilt, I could have these shapes, and then I could also, I'll take this one, and then I'm going to make some triangles out of it. And then I'm going to place this right over top, kind of like an applique. And I could do that. I could make something bigger. I could make a nice big heart. I could make a little flower in here. I could make, my first name starts with an L, so I can make an L shape. So that's one of the really fun thing is you get to make whatever you want. But if you are kind of interested in creating a quilt like from the past, you can go onto our collections database, which I'll include a link for as well, and you can just search quilts and you can see some of the beautiful quilts that we have in our collection beyond what Jacob showed us this morning. And I'm gonna make it double wide, but leaving a little bit of space, and then working upside down. There we go. So now I have an L. But again, you can do whatever you want. This is your creation. And if you have other fabric scraps laying around, you could also introduce some different materials. You could do something like with a satin, so something smooth and shiny. You could do just like a plain cotton. You could even use like minky or fleece. Just something you could introduce to kind of show a different texture. And again, this is completely your design. For my very first one, I only used squares and triangles. And then, so I created a sun in the corner, a bit of a blue sky, to re-glue that one. And then, so I have some flowers in a field. So again, like this one I tried to play with the pinwheel idea, like we're going to do on Wednesday, but you can just completely play with it and create it. And it's one of those things kind of like stained glass. You can look at something like a field outside or your garden, or even the beach, and you could plan out what you want to create in your image, just making it more simple, more simplified shapes, which is a lot of fun. And for those that are younger, it's really good if you're able to name the shapes. It can be kind of like, we always have fun at supper time cutting our food into different shapes. So we have to ask if grilled cheese is triangles or squares and things like that. So we always just try to play with shapes and make sure everyone knows what they're actually called. Hence the whole rhombus instead of a diamond. But we're going to do a quick check and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, and I don't see any questions today, but I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning to learn about making your felt quilt. And for applying the felt, I did find that white glue worked really well, just like school glue, but you could also use a hot glue or a fabric glue. And things just always pop up. So the background is white for your quilt, but it is a canvas. So you could also paint the background and create that into the quilt and use the felt to make appliques. So there's so much you could do with this activity, and you could even use that to design a quilt and then create something later on with supplies you have at home. But anyways, thank you so much. There's so much you can do, but thank you for joining us. And if you are finished your craft, don't forget to send us an email of some images, or if you post it online, you can tag us at #MBMGreatRoots. But thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you later.